talked about the general body compartments, the movement of substances bidirectionally in a kind of a semi-permeable or selective manner. We've also talked about the water compartments and then the subdivisions of those compartments. Okay, let's look at a few checkpoint questions here. Oops. And we'll just kind of discuss these openly. You can feel free to write responses in the chat or just verbalize responses as well. So what is the difference between absorption and reabsorption? What is the difference between absorption and reabsorption?
I would say absorption is the initial taking in of things. When things go through your skin possibly or through your pores, that's like initial absorption, but reabsorption is when something goes out but then comes back in. So I'm not sure if this is entirely accurate, but water leaving the cells and then coming back in, getting reabsorbed back into the cells.
Yep, that's a good example. Yep, so you're absolutely correct. Absorption is the initial movement of substances into our internal environment. So substances that have never been in our internal environment. Think about nutrients from a meal that you've eaten. Reabsorption is really the reclaiming of substances that were previously filtered. And the main example here is really in the kidneys where we see reabsorption. So most of our plasma is filtered through the initial parts of the kidney. And then substances that we need, usually things like amino acids, water is reabsorbed as well, because we don't want to lose too much water in the urine, especially if we're dehydrated. And so that is reclaiming things that were once in our internal environment that have been lost or filtered out. And so we want to reclaim those substances. Excellent. Let's look at number 2. Why is extracellular fluid referred to as the body's internal environment? So why do we still consider extracellular fluid internal environment? What's the explanation there?
Is the fluid for the extracellular fluid outside of like your organs and stuff? So technically it's like internalized in your body?
Excellent. Yeah, so it's still within our internal environment. Although it's not inside our cells, it's outside the cells, but it's still a part of our internal environment. Excellent. Okay. Give the proper term for each of the following. So let's kind of go through these one by one. So what do we call all the water contained in the body?
Total body fluid?
Yep, that's our total body water, or total body fluid. What do we call fluid contained within the cells?
Intercellular fluid?
Intracellular fluid. What about the fluid located outside our cells?
External.
Extracellular fluid, excellent. Now, mind you, although it's located outside our cells, we can't deduce whether it's plasma or interstitial fluid unless we're told exactly where that fluid is outside our cells. So when we look at D, fluid located outside the cells and in the blood, what do we call that compartment? Outside of our cells, but it's still within our blood vessels.
Is that the interstitial fluid?
So that's not interstitial fluid, it's the other one.
Plasma?
The plasma, excellent. So remember, plasma is the fluid that bathes our red blood cells within our vessels. So that's going to be outside of our cells, but inside our vessels. And then the second extracellular fluid compartment is fluid located outside the cells, but inside the blood vessels. Excuse me, outside of our cells and outside of the blood vessels. That's going to be what someone just said, I think, earlier, the interstitial fluid, right? So outside of our cells, outside of our blood vessels is the interstitial fluid. Outside of our cells, inside our blood vessels is the plasma, okay? I hope that was clear. Let's move right along to objective 2, which is homeostasis, and then explaining its significance to the function of our body. Really, really important concept. Homeostasis is something we're going to continue to refer to. We're going to continue to talk about. It's a common theme throughout all of our anatomy and physiology. Another common theme that we're going to see is form follows function, structure and function. The main theme of this course, anatomy and physiology, is structure and function. The way that a thing looks, the way that it is shaped, or structured has a lot to do with how it functions. And structure and function are related to each other in both ways, right? Things look a certain way to bring about a certain function, but then a certain function is brought about because things are structured differently. Okay, so that form and function is a really important relationship that we will also continue to see throughout the course. So as we talk about homeostasis, let's start by reflecting on this question. So how does our body tend to keep our body temperature, our blood pH, our blood volume, and other important variables? How does our body tend to keep those things relatively constant day after day after day after day, indefinitely? How do we do that? If you think about when you go to your doctor, you know, the doctor measures your blood pressure, it's usually right around the same range, right? Depending on how your day is going and probably what time of the day you measure your blood pressure, but it's usually within a very constant range. And anytime it deviates from that range, it usually creates some alarming signals in our body, maybe headaches, or maybe chills or fatigue if it gets too low. So how does our body tend to keep these variables so constant indefinitely? What are some of your thoughts about this?
I don't know if this is right, but does the amount of water have to do with it in your body?
So that's also one of the variables that's regulated. So that's a good thing to add as far as the list of variables that are constant. The amount of water in our body is also relatively constant as well. And then what are some?
I would say,
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I would say probably for like body temperature, sweating versus shivering.
Yep, so sweating versus shivering is one of an example of that mechanism, so that's exactly correct. And then in the chat here, I'm seeing the word homeostasis, right? And to kind of break down homeostasis, that is basically detecting slight changes, being able to detect those changes initially, that's probably the most important part, so that the body can then make very fine-tuned changes to correct those slight changes. And that's essentially what homeostasis is. So as several of you have quite correctly mentioned, is we want to keep things constant, but we really want to detect the fine changes. So someone said shivering or sweating. In order for the body to shiver or to sweat, it would first have to be monitoring very closely what the internal body temperature is so that it can make very fine-tuned changes such as shivering or sweating to bring that body temperature back to where it needs to be. So very good responses here. And this is really kind of breaking down not only what homeostasis is, but why it's so important. We want to keep these things constant. I don't want to have a blood pressure of 300 tomorrow and then maybe 100 today. That's not ideal for our internal physiology. Things need to be kept very, very relatively constant. Okay. And so homeostasis is the ability to maintain a relatively constant internal environment. And I want to kind of add to this description in the face of external changes. So while we think about changing our external environment, this is what actually allows us to evolve as human beings, to be exposed to different external environments, but not die essentially, or our species to die off, is because we can exist in harsh environments, but our internal environment doesn't have to change. So if you think about moving to somewhere really cold, like Duluth, and being exposed to colder temperatures, our internal physiology doesn't have to be the temperature that it is outside. And so we can exist in cold climates, we can exist in hot climates, we can exist in all types of different external environments. But because of homeostasis, we can still maintain a relatively constant internal environment in the face of those external changes. Some of the components or variables that are regulated or are tightly controlled are our body temperature, our body volume. So think about our plasma volumes, the amount of water, which someone correctly pointed out, our body composition. In composition, we mean the amount of fat to muscle that is in our body. That is also relatively constant unless you work out and actually change your muscle proportions and so on. And then our blood pH is another important regulated variable. So what is the acidity or the alkalinity of our blood? How much acid, how much alkaline is in our blood? That is also very tightly regulated. And we'll talk about how the kidneys and the lungs play a part in that later on. Now, this is going to require integration between various systems. Someone mentioned, and I love the example that someone brought up, which was shivering and sweating, because that's a really good example of just integrating that we're talking about. So because of our internal body temperature, either getting too high or too low, an entirely different organ system needs to do something else in order to then correct that, that change. And so we see shivering with our muscles actually to generate some heat. We see, for sweating, we see the dilation of our pores on our skin, so the integument system, the muscular system. And so as you would imagine, it also applies for things like blood pressure, where the heart has to do something different. The kidneys have to do something different. And so there's this integration of various organ systems in order to bring about this homeostasis. Now, when we have disruption to homeostasis, this is where we start to introduce the basis for disease and eventually for death. So anytime we throw homeostasis off, think about high blood pressure, think about low blood pressure, especially chronic high blood pressure, we start to introduce disease, kidney damage. We start to introduce what's considered as entropy, and then eventually we will get to death. Okay, so disease is the initial disruption of homeostasis, which will eventually lead to death. Okay, and when I say death, not necessarily having to be death of the organismal level, but we can think about death of cells. We can think about death of organ tissues. We can think about a part of the heart dying. If you have a myocardial infarction, there's lack of flow to that part of the heart. That part of the heart can die. That's a heart attack. So not necessarily death of the whole organism, but think about death on a microscopic and even organelle level as well. All right, let's look at this little schematic here, if you will, this image here, which is showing 3 states of this kind of rock formation. And let's think about this image to help us explain homeostasis a little bit better. Now, homeostasis is not saying that things will always be pristine and perfect and blood pressure will always be perfect the way that things are shown here on the left, right? So this kind of, stable, structured rock formation is where we're striving to be, but it's not where we always are. And so homeostasis is really looking like the middle picture, okay? Is the correction, is the fine tuning, is the detecting. Homeostasis is not that things are always great, but it's the striving for things to always be, relatively constant in that way. And so if things get shifted far to the other end of the spectrum, this is where we start to see disruption of homeostasis, and we start to see the introduction of disease and then eventually death. And so this is where we don't want to be. This is where we want to be. And then homeostasis is what actually helps to keep us in that state that we want to be, keep things relatively constant. So it's not something that is achieved and done. It is a constant striving to keep things in that relative constant state.